In the Chicago underworld, silence isn't peace. It's a death sentence. They called him the Wraith. Silas Vane, the capo, who never spoke a word. The man born into a world of total silence, but who controlled the noise of the city with an iron fist. Everyone knew the rule. You never look him in the eye, and you never, ever startle him. But when a timid new maid was caught snooping in his private study, she didn't beg for mercy. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out her rusty, blood-stained object that didn't just stop the execution. It froze the most dangerous man in America in his tracks. This is the story of how a single forgotten relic brought an empire to its knees. The rain in Chicago didn't wash away the sins. It just made the pavement slicker for the bodies to slide. Silas Vane stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse overlooking the Chicago River. The glass was bulletproof, 3 inches thick, vibrating slightly from the thunder rolling over the skyline. Silas didn't hear the thunder. He felt it. He felt it in the soles of his Italian leather shoes, a dull thrumming against his bones. To Silas, the world was a symphony of vibrations. The slam of a car door was a sharp jolt. A gunshot was a punch to the chest. Fear was a trembling frequency he could sense radiating off a man's skin. He turned around. The room was expensive, decorated in stark minimalist grays and blacks. Kneeling on the Persian rug was a man named Joey the Rat Moretti. Joey was screaming. Silas could tell by the way the veins in Joey's neck bulged and his jaw unhinged, spittle flying onto the polished mahogany floor. Silas didn't blink. He just watched the performance. Standing beside Silas was Elias Cross, his consigliere, and the only man allowed to speak for him. Elias was sharp-featured, wearing a suit that cost more than most people's houses. He watched Silas's hands. Silas raised his right hand. He signed, sharp and fluid. Ask him who he sold the shipping routes to. Elias cleared his throat, his voice devoid of emotion. Mr. Vane wants to know who bought the routes, Joey. He's losing patience. Joey sobbed, shaking his head. I didn't, I swear, Elias. It was a mistake. I thought... Silas stepped forward. The movement was so smooth it was predatory. He grabbed Joey by the throat. He didn't squeeze to choke. He squeezed to feel. He placed his thumb over Joey's larynx. Scream. Silas signed with his free hand, his eyes dead cold. Elias translated. Scream. Joey screamed. Silas closed his eyes, feeling the vibration of the vocal cords against his thumb. It was a lie. The vibration was too erratic, too desperate. A truth-teller's voice had a different resonance. Steady. Resigned. Joey was frantic. He was hiding something. Silas released him and snapped his fingers. 2 guards stepped out of the shadows. Silas made a cutting motion across his own neck, then pointed to the elevator. Take him to the basement, Elias ordered. Finish it. As they dragged the weeping man away, Silas wiped his hand on a silk handkerchief and walked back to his desk. He hated the feeling of a liar's voice on his skin. It felt like grease. He sat down, the silence of the room wrapping around him like a heavy blanket. This was his kingdom. The Vane crime family controlled the docks, the unions, and the high-stakes gambling rings from the Loop to the South Side, and Silas had built it all without ever speaking a word. His deafness, a birth defect that had caused his father to nearly drown him as an infant, had become his greatest weapon. He saw things hearing men missed. He saw the twitch of an eye, the hesitation of a hand. A light flashed on his desk, a visual intercom. Someone was at the service entrance. Elias checked his tablet. It's the agency, the new housekeeping staff. You fired the last 3. Silas signed. Send her in. If she drops a single vase. She joins Joey. A moment later, the heavy oak doors opened. Clara Holloway stepped inside. She was small, perhaps 24, with brown hair pulled back in a severe, messy bun that suggested she didn't have time for vanity. Her uniform was slightly too big, the gray fabric swallowing her slender frame. She clutched a bucket of cleaning supplies like a shield. Silas watched her. He didn't look at her face. He looked at her walk. Most people walked into his office with hesitation, their weight shifting backward, ready to flee. Clara walked with a strange, heavier cadence, determined, grounded. She stopped 10 feet from the desk and didn't bow. She just looked at him. Elias stepped forward. "Name?" "Clara Holloway," she said. Silas read her lips. Her enunciation was perfect. Almost too perfect. Like she was used to speaking to people who couldn't hear. "You know the rules," Elias said, boring holes into her with his gaze. "You clean. You don't look at Mr. Vane. You don't speak to Mr. Vane. You don't touch anything on this desk. If you see something, you forget it immediately. Do you understand?" "I understand," Clara said. Silas narrowed his eyes. He tapped the desk. Elias looked at his boss. Silas signed. "She's lying." Elias stiffened. "Mr. Vane thinks you're hiding something." Clara didn't flinch. She shifted her grip on the bucket. "I'm hiding a criminal record for petty theft, sir. That's why I can't get a job anywhere else. I need this money. I won't steal from you. I know who you are." It was a bold admission. Silas studied her. The vibration of her footsteps earlier had been steady. Now, he watched the pulse in her neck. It was fast, but her face was stone. She was terrified, but she was holding it together. Silas liked desperation. Desperate people were predictable. They worked hard. He waved his hand dismissively. Let her work. But watch her. "You're hired on a trial basis," Elias said. "Start in the library. Do not enter the master bedroom." Clara nodded, her eyes lingering on Silas for a fraction of a second too long, before she turned and walked out. Silas watched her go. There was something about her gait. She didn't walk like a maid. She walked like a soldier marching into a minefield. He turned back to his paperwork, but for the first time in years, a prickle of unease ran down his spine. The silence of the room suddenly felt less like a shield and more like a cage. 2 weeks passed. Clara Holloway was a ghost. She moved through the sprawling Vane estate like a shadow. She cleaned the marble floors until they mirrored the ceiling. She dusted the extensive art collection without leaving a fingerprint. She was efficient, silent, and obedient. But Silas was watching. He had cameras in every room, feeds that streamed directly to his tablet. He watched her when he couldn't sleep, which was often. He noticed things. He noticed how she paused whenever she passed the portrait of his late father, Marcus Vane, in the hallway. She didn't look at it with awe or fear. She looked at it with recognition, contempt. He also noticed that she was testing boundaries. One day, she cleaned the hallway while he was in a meeting, inching closer to the open door. Another day, she accidentally dropped a metal tray while he was facing away, then watched his reflection in the window to see if he reacted. She was testing his deafness. It was a Wednesday evening, the sky bruised purple with twilight, when Silas returned early from a meeting with the commission. His suit was splattered with microscopic specks of blood, a negotiation gone wrong with the Russian syndicate. He was agitated. He needed the sanctuary of his private study. He bypassed the security detail and stormed up the stairs, his mood foul. He pushed open the double doors to his study and stopped. Clara was there. She wasn't cleaning. She was standing behind his massive ebony desk, her back to the door. She had opened the locked bottom drawer, the one that required a biometric fingerprint. How? Rage, cold and white-hot, flooded Silas's veins. That drawer contained the ledgers, the names of the politicians on his payroll, the coordinates of the safe houses. He moved. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, his footsteps silent on the thick carpet. Clara must have felt the displacement of air, or perhaps the vibration of his approach. She spun around, her eyes going wide. She was holding a file, but it wasn't the blackmail ledger. It was an old, leather-bound journal that Silas kept hidden beneath the false bottom of the drawer, his mother's journal. Silas didn't hesitate. He grabbed her by the throat and slammed her back against the bookshelves. Books tumbled down, hitting the floor with thuds he felt in his feet. Clara gasped, clawing at his hand. Her face turned red. Silas's face was a mask of demonic fury. He didn't sign. He didn't need to. He was going to snap her neck. She was a spy, an assassin, a rat. Clara's eyes were frantic. She kicked out, her legs flailing. But he was immovable. She was losing consciousness. Then her hand dived into the pocket of her apron. Silas tightened his grip, expecting a knife or a syringe. He prepared to crush her windpipe instantly, but she didn't pull out a weapon. She yanked out a small, tarnished object and slammed it down hard onto the wooden surface of the desk next to them. Thwack! The vibration traveled through the wood, up through Silas's hip, leaning against the desk, and into his spine. It was a sharp, metallic resonance. Distinct. He ignored it. He squeezed tighter. Clara, gasping for air, slammed the object down again, harder, and again. A rhythmic, desperate pounding. 1, 2, 3. Pause. 1, 2. Silas froze. His grip didn't loosen, but his muscles locked. That rhythm. 1, 2, 3. Pause. 1, 2. It wasn't random. It was a code. A vibration code he hadn't felt in 20 years. He looked down at the desk. Lying there, under her trembling hand, was not a weapon. It was a tuning fork, but not a standard medical one. It was heavy, made of darkened silver, with a handle carved into the shape of a serpent eating its own tail, the Ouroboros. Silas stared at it. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. He knew that object. It belonged to Dr. Aris Thorne, the private physician who had treated him when he was a boy. The man who had told Silas's father that the boy's hearing was gone forever. The man who had vanished the night Silas's parents were murdered. Silas released Clara. She crumpled to the floor, coughing violently, clutching her throat. Silas backed away, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. He looked from the girl to the tuning fork. He reached out a trembling hand and picked it up. The metal was cold. He struck it against the desk and held the stem to his jawbone. The vibration rattled his skull. Pitch A4, 100 to 40. The specific frequency Dr. Thorne used to test for residual nerve activity. He looked at Clara. She was on her knees, tears streaming down her face, sucking in greedy gulps of air. Where? Silas tried to speak. His voice was a rusty, unused growl, deep and guttural. He hadn't spoken aloud in a decade. Where did get this? Clara looked up, her eyes blazing with a mixture of fear and defiance. She wiped blood from her lip. She raised her hands. Her fingers moved not in American Sign Language, but in a primitive, made-up sign language, a home sign system that Silas had invented with his twin brother, Julian, when they were 6 years old. A language only the two of them knew. Julian is not dead, she signed, her movements shaky but precise. Silas felt like he had been shot. Julian had died in the fire that killed their parents. Silas had seen the body. Clara reached for the tuning fork and turned it over. She pointed to the base of the handle. Silas squinted. Etched into the silver, so faint it was almost invisible, were coordinates. And a date. Tomorrow's date. "Who are you?" Silas signed, his movements frantic, abandoning his composure. Clara stood up, using the desk for support. She looked him dead in the eye and spoke slowly, ensuring he caught every syllable. "My name isn't Clara," she said. "My father was Dr. Thorne. He didn't run away, Silas. He was taken, just like your brother." She took a step closer to the most dangerous man in Chicago, no longer afraid. "You aren't deaf because of a fever, Silas," she whispered, though she knew he couldn't hear the sound, only read the shape of the truth. "The tuning fork. It's the key. Your uncle put an implant in your skull to block the nerve. You aren't deaf. You're being jammed." Silas stared at her. The silence that had defined his life for 30 years suddenly felt very, very loud. He looked at the tuning fork in his hand. If she was lying, he would peel the skin from her bones. But if she was telling the truth? He looked at the portrait of his uncle Don Salvatore hanging above the fireplace. The man who had raised him. The man who had given him the empire. Silas reached into his jacket and pulled out his gun. He didn't point it at Clara. He placed it on the desk, spinning it so the handle faced her. "Show me," he signed. Clara nodded. She reached into her blouse and pulled out a second object, a powerful handheld magnet. "This is going to hurt," she said. Silas gripped the edge of the desk. "Do it." She stepped behind him and placed the magnet against the base of his skull, right behind his left ear, where a thin white scar had been hidden by his hair for decades. Click, a sound. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't music. It was a high-pitched, screaming whine, like a microphone feedback loop, exploding inside Silas's head. He fell to his knees, clutching his head, a guttural roar tearing from his throat. It was the most painful thing he had ever felt. It was the sound of the world coming back. The world was not silent. It was screaming. Silas Vane lay curled on the Persian rug of his study, hands clamped over his ears, his body convulsing. The silence he had known for 25 years had been a heavy, suffocating blanket. But this was a violent assault. It wasn't clear sound. It was a cacophony of static, high-pitched whining, and a thumping bass that felt like a hammer against his skull. The magnet Ilara, held against his mastoid bone was disrupting the frequency of the jammer, but the sudden influx of auditory data was short-circuiting his brain. "Breathe," a voice said. Silas gasped. He didn't just see the lips move. He heard a distorted, watery sound that matched them. "Breathe her?" He looked up at the maid. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. She pulled the magnet away slightly. The screaming in his head dampened, returning to a dull roar. "It's too much," she whispered. "Your auditory nerve hasn't been used since you were 6. It's like staring into the sun after living in a cave." Silas grit his teeth, forcing himself to sit up. The room spun. He looked at the grandfather clock in the corner. For decades, he had only seen the pendulum swing. Now, he heard it. Tick-tock, tick-tock. It was maddeningly loud. He grabbed a notepad from the floor and scribbled, the pen scratching loudly against the paper. "Make it stop. I can't turn it off completely without surgery," Ilara said, her voice trembling. "But I can dampen it. The magnet is just a jammer for the jammer. Silas, we have to move. Your uncle, if he knows I'm here, if he knows you can hear." Silas held up a hand. He squeezed his eyes shut. He was trying to filter the noise, the hum of the air conditioner, the distant wail of a siren, the blood rushing in his own ears. Then he heard footsteps, not the vibration in the floor. He heard the scuff of leather on wood. Rapid, approaching the study doors. Ilara's eyes darted to the door. She shoved the tuning fork and the magnet into her pocket and scrambled back, grabbing her cleaning bucket. Silas composed himself. He sat in his chair, his face a mask of stone, though his head felt like it was splitting open. He stared at the paperwork, pretending to read. The door burst open. It was Elias. Silas didn't look up. He waited for the vibration, as he always did. But he didn't need to wait. He heard Elias's heavy, panicked breathing. Elias walked to the desk. He slammed his hand down. Silas looked up slowly, giving his usual cold, dead stare. Elias signed, "We have a problem." The shipments at the docks were intercepted. Silas watched the hand signs, but for the first time, he heard the man's voice accompanying the movement. Elias was mumbling while he signed. "Stupid cripple." Elias muttered under his breath, his lips barely moving, the sound a low, venomous hiss. "Whole empire burning, and I'm playing charades with a broken toy." Silas felt a shock wave go through his chest, colder than any ice. Elias had been his right hand for 10 years. Elias had fed him, clothed him, translated for him. Elias was the only man Silas trusted, and Elias had been mocking him to his face every single day. Silas kept his face impassive. He signed back. "Handle it. Take the men?" Elias nodded, feigning respect. "Yes, Mr. Vane, I'll take care of it immediately." But as Elias turned to leave, he pulled his phone from his pocket. He didn't leave the room. He walked to the far corner near the bookshelf, assuming Silas couldn't hear him, and that the maid was too terrified to understand the context. Elias dialed a number. Silas strained. The sound was muddy, like listening through a thick wall, but he focused on the consonants. "Yeah, it's me," Elias whispered into the phone. "No, he doesn't suspect. The maid is just cleaning. Yeah, Salvatore. Tonight. I'm moving the funds to the offshore account. No, the deaf freak won't know he's bankrupt until the check bounces. Yeah, kill him after the transfer. Midnight. Kill him after the transfer." The words hung in the air, heavier than the thunder outside. Uncle Salvatore, the man who had taken Silas in after the fire, the man who sat at the head of the table at Christmas. He had orchestrated it all. The implant, the deafness, the isolation. Silas wasn't a nephew. He was a placeholder, a puppet king keeping the seat warm until Salvatore could liquidate the assets and vanish. Elias hung up and turned back, offering a fake, tight smile. He waved a hand, a dismissive gesture he used when he thought Silas wasn't looking. He walked out, closing the door with a soft click. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was pregnant with violence. Silas looked at Ilara. She was standing by the bookshelf, her face drained of color. She had heard it too. "He's going to kill you," she whispered. "Tonight." Silas stood up. The vertigo was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. The noise of the world was no longer painful. It was fuel. He walked over to the wall safe hidden behind a painting of the Chicago skyline. He didn't need the combination. He punched it in by memory. Inside were 2 Glock 19s suppressed and a stack of cash. He handed one gun to Ilara. She stared at it. "I'm a medical student, not a hitman." Silas grabbed her hand and pressed the cold steel into her palm. He pulled out his phone and typed a message, showing it to her. "You are now." He holstered his own weapon and grabbed his coat. He looked around the room, his prison for the last decade. He walked to the desk, picked up a heavy crystal decanter of scotch, and hurled it at the wall. Crash! The sound was magnificent. He turned to Ilara. He didn't sign. He opened his mouth, his vocal cords rusty and tight, his tongue feeling foreign in his mouth. He forced air through his larynx, mimicking the sounds he had just heard Elias make. "We," Silas rasped, and the word was a croak, deep and broken. "We. Go." Ilara's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. "Where?" Silas reached into his pocket and pulled out the tuning fork. He tapped the coordinates etched into the silver. "St. Jude's home for the forgotten. We go get my brother," Silas rasped. "Then we kill them all." The drive out of the city was a sensory nightmare. Silas drove the black armored SUV, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The rain hammered against the roof like bullets. Rat-a-tat-tat-tat. The windshield wipers screeched. Swish-thwack, swish-thwack. Every honk of a horn made him flinch. Ilara sat in the passenger seat, navigating. "Take the next exit. It's deep in the forest preserve, off the grid." Silas nodded. His jaw clenched. He was learning to filter. He focused on the hum of the engine, using it as a baseline to anchor his reality. "My father figured it out," Ilara said softly, her voice competing with the rain. "Dr. Thorne. He realized the fever that took your hearing was a lie. He found the incision scar on your skull during a checkup, when you were 7. He confronted Salvatore." "Dead?" Silas asked. His voice was getting stronger, though still rough, like gravel grinding together. "Salvatore didn't kill him," Ilara said, looking out the window. "He put him in St. Jude S to keep him quiet. That's where he met your brother. Julian wasn't dead either. Salvatore needed a spare heir, just in case you didn't work out. So he kept Julian on ice. Literally." Silas tightened his grip on the wheel. He remembered Julian, his twin, the one who used to tap Morse code on the bed frame when they were scared of the dark. Tap, tap, tap. They turned onto a gravel road. The trees closed in, skeletal branches clawing at the sky. A rusted gate loomed ahead, marked with a faded sign, St. Jude's Home for the Forgotten, private property. Silas killed the headlights. He rode the car to a stop 50 yards from the gate. Cameras, Silas rasped. Looping, Ilara said, tapping on a laptop she had taken from the penthouse. I uploaded a virus to their network 10 minutes ago. We have a 5-minute window before the system reboots. Silas looked at her with newfound respect. Smart. Desperate, she corrected. They exited the car. The rain soaked them instantly. The forest was loud, leaves rustling, wind howling. Silas felt exposed. For years he had relied on sight lines. Now he felt threats he couldn't see. They moved towards the main building, a hulking Victorian-era brick structure that looked like a rotting tooth against the night sky. There were 2 guards at the side entrance, smoking cigarettes under an awning. Silas approached from the shadows. He moved with the silence of a predator, but the wet leaves crunched under his boots. Crunch. One guard turned. Hear that? Silas froze. He wasn't used to making noise. He cursed himself. Probably a raccoon, the other guard said. Silas didn't wait. He stepped out, raising his suppressed Glock. Pip. 2 shots. 2 bodies dropped. The sound of the slide racking back was mechanical and crisp. Silas felt a grim satisfaction. He stepped over the bodies, checking their pockets for a keycard. He found one. They slipped inside. The asylum smelled of bleach and urine. The lighting was flickering fluorescent yellow. And the sound. It was a house of horrors. Moans echoed from behind steel doors. Manic laughter drifted down the hallway. Someone was screaming, a high, rhythmic shriek that grated on Silas's raw nerves. Basement, Ilara whispered. Level 4. That's where they keep the high-value patients. They moved down the stairwell, descending into the belly of the beast. Silas led, his gun sweeping every corner. His head was pounding again. The hum of the electricity in the walls was buzzing in his teeth. Level 4 was freezing. The air was thick with condensation. There were only 3 cells here. Silas checked the first door's viewport. An empty, padded room. He checked the second. An old man sat in the corner. Ilara gasped. Dad! The man looked up. He was gaunt, his beard white and matted, but his eyes were sharp. Dr. Thorne. Ilara fumbled with the keycard, swiping it. The door beeped and unlocked. She rushed in, hugging the frail man. Silas stood guard at the door. Julian? He asked the doctor. Doctor? Thorne looked at Silas, his eyes widening as he saw the scar, the stance. Silas, you can hear. Where is he? Silas demanded, his voice echoing in the concrete hall. Cell 3, Thorne rasped. But Silas, be careful. They've been giving him psychotropics for 20 years. He's not whole. Silas moved to the 3rd door. It was heavier than the others, reinforced steel. There was no viewport, only a sliding food slot. Silas didn't swipe the card. He hesitated. He was the Mafia boss of Chicago. He had killed men with his bare hands, but he was terrified of what was behind this door. He swiped the card. The heavy lock tumbled with a loud clank. The door creaked open. The room was dark. Silas raised his gun, stepping inside. Julian? There was a scratching sound from the corner. Silas pulled a small flashlight from his tactical belt and shone it into the darkness. A figure was crouched in the corner, shirtless, ribs showing through pale skin. The man had long, tangled black hair. He was scratching something into the padded wall with a sharpened fingernail. Silas stepped closer. The man turned. It was like looking in a funhouse mirror. The face was Silas's face, but twisted. Wild eyes, a jagged scar running down his cheek. Julian, Silas said. The man tilted his head. He didn't speak. He raised his hand and tapped his ear. Tap, tap, tap. Then Julian smiled, a broken, jagged smile. Wraith speaks, Julian whispered. His voice was beautiful, melodic, the exact opposite of Silas's rusty croak. Brother, did you bring the noise? We're leaving, Silas said, reaching out a hand. Julian laughed. It was a dry, rattling sound. Leaving? No. The party is just starting. Dr. Nero is coming. As if on cue, an alarm blared. A siren so loud it dropped Silas to his knees. Way. It was an auditory assault. Silas dropped his gun, clutching his head, screaming in agony as the sound tore through his sensitive, newly awakened nerves. Lights flooded the hallway outside. Well, a smooth voice came from the doorway. Silas looked up through blurry vision. A man in a white suit stood there, flanked by 4 armored guards holding assault rifles. He held a cane with a silver handle. Dr. Nero, the warden. The deaf king and the mad prince, Nero sneered, and the little maid who couldn't scrub away her past. How poetic. Nero looked at Silas, who was writhing on the floor from the siren. "Turn it up," Nero ordered his men. One of the guards turned a dial on the wall. The siren's pitch increased to a dog whistle screech. Silas's vision went white. He felt blood trickle from his nose. He was paralyzed by the sound. He couldn't reach his gun. He couldn't fight. Ilara and her father were dragged out of the other cell, thrown to the floor next to Silas. "Salvatore will be pleased," Nero said, pulling a gold-plated revolver from his jacket. He aimed it at Silas's head. He always said twins were bad luck. 1 is a tragedy. 2 is a redundancy. Nero cocked the hammer. Click. Silas squeezed his eyes shut. He couldn't focus. The sound was killing him. Suddenly the scratching stopped. Julian stood up. He didn't cover his ears. He was smiling. He began to hum, a low, baritone note that cut under the siren. Julian looked at Silas. He signed, his movements lightning fast. Watch the rhythm.
Julian stomped his foot.
Boom. He clapped his hands. Clack. He stomped again. Boom. It was the code. The Ouroboros rhythm. Silas focused on the vibration in the floor, anchoring himself to it, ignoring the siren. Julian lunged, not at Nero, but at the guard controlling the siren dial. He moved with the frantic energy of a lunatic. He bit the guard's neck, ripping the flesh. The guard screamed. The siren cut off as the body hit the controls. Silence. Beautiful, ringing silence. Silas gasped, the pressure in his skull vanishing. He rolled, grabbing his gun from the floor. Nero turned, firing a shot wild. Silas didn't miss. He didn't aim with his eyes. He aimed with the sound of Nero's breathing. Bang! Nero fell, a hole in his chest. The other 3 guards raised their rifles. Down! Silas roared, a true commanding shout this time. Ilara and Dr. Thorne hit the deck. Silas and Julian moved in unison. It was a dance of violence they had never practiced, but somehow knew. Silas went low. Julian went high. Silas fired double taps into 2 guards. Julian grabbed the 3rd guard's rifle barrel, twisting it with maniacal strength, and headbutting the man into unconsciousness. In 10 seconds, the room was clear. Silas stood, chest heaving, smoke rising from his gun. He looked at Julian. Julian wiped blood from his mouth. He looked at Silas and grinned. "You're loud, brother," Julian said. "I like it." Silas looked at Ilara. She was shaking, holding her father. "We move," Silas rasped. "Now." He walked over to Nero's body and took the master key ring. He turned to Julian. "Can you run?" Julian laughed, spinning in a circle. "I've been running in my head for 20 years, Silas. Try to keep up." They sprinted down the hallway, the alarm still flashing silent red lights. They had the doctor. They had the brother. They had the truth. But as they burst out of the asylum doors and into the rain, Silas heard a sound that chilled his blood. Not a siren. Not a gunshot. The distinct, rhythmic thumping of a helicopter rotor blade. Silas looked up. A spotlight blinded them. Salvatore Vane had arrived, and he hadn't come to talk. The spotlight from the helicopter pinned them to the wet asphalt like insects under a magnifying glass. For Silas, it wasn't the light that hurt. It was the sound. The thwop, thwop, thwop of the rotors wasn't just a noise. It was a physical concussive force slamming against his eardrums, vibrating his teeth, making his vision blur. He had spent 30 years in a silent film. Now he was trapped inside a jet engine. "Run!" Ilara screamed, grabbing her father's arm. Silas couldn't move. His equilibrium was shattered. The world tilted sideways. Julian was the one who reacted. He grabbed Silas's collar, his face inches away. His eyes were wild, dilated, reflecting the spotlight. "Don't listen to the machine, brother," Julian yelled over the roar. "Listen to the rhythm. It's a 4/4 beat. Find the gap." Thwip, thwip, thwip. Gap. Silas forced himself to focus. He found the millisecond of silence between the rotor spins. He latched onto it. Bullets began to chew up the pavement around them. Ping, ping, crack. The woods. Silas roared, the sound of his own voice still alien to him. They scrambled toward the tree line. The forest was a wall of darkness, but for Silas, it was a wall of noise. As they crashed through the underbrush, every snapping twig sounded like a bone breaking. The rain hitting the leaves sounded like static on a television. The wind howling through the branches sounded like a choir of screams. He stumbled, his hands covering his ears. "Too loud. It's too loud." Ilara was there instantly, her hands on his shoulders. "Focus on my voice, Silas. Just my voice. Anchor to it." "They're flanking us," Dr. Thorne wheezed, looking back. "Salvatore's hit squad. They use thermal. They'll see us." Julian stopped. He tilted his head, looking up at the rain-soaked canopy. It was humming again, a low, discordant tune. He reached out and touched a massive oak tree. "Not thermal," Julian whispered. "Vibration sensors. They're tracking the footsteps. Heavy boots. Thud, thud." Julian looked at Silas. "You know the ghost walk, brother. Dad taught us. Before the fire." Silas blinked, the memory surfacing through the pain. Walk heel to toe. Roll the weight. Become the air. "Lead," Silas rasped. They moved deeper into the forest preserve. The Cook County woods were dense, a tangled mess of thorns and mud. Julian took point, moving with a strange, fluid grace. He didn't snap a single twig. He moved like smoke. Silas followed, mimicking the movement. He focused on the sound of his own breathing, trying to tune out the chaos. In, out, in, out. Behind them, the shouts of men echoed. "Fan out. Check the perimeter." Silas heard the distinct metallic click of a safety being disengaged. It came from the left. He stopped. He raised his hand. Ilara froze. Silas closed his eyes. He didn't look, he listened. He heard the squelch of a boot in mud, the rustle of a synthetic raincoat. Breathing, heavy, excited breathing. 10 feet, 9 o'clock. Silas raised his Glock. He didn't need to see the man. The sound painted a picture in his mind more vivid than sight. He could hear the man's heart beating, a rapid thump, thump. Silas fired blindly through a thick bush. Bang. A cry of pain, then a heavy thud. Ilara stared at him, stunned. You didn't even look." "I didn't have to," Silas said, lowered the gun. He felt a surge of terrifying power. For years, people had whispered behind his back, thinking he was broken. Now he could hear their very intentions before they acted. "Keep moving," Julian hissed. "The chopper is circling back." They reached a drainage ravine. A concrete pipe, half submerged in muddy water, led under the highway. Inside, Silas ordered. They scrambled into the pipe. The smell was foul, decay and sewage. But the thick concrete muffled the helicopter's roar. They huddled in the dark. Dr. Thorne was shivering violently. Ilara was checking his pulse. Silas sat against the curved wall, his head in his hands. The silence here was relative, filled only with the drip of water and the distant hum of traffic on the highway above. Julian sat opposite him, cross-legged, tracing patterns in the algae on the wall. "You hear it now, don't you?" Julian asked softly. "The symphony. The world never shuts up, Silas. It never stops complaining." Silas looked at his twin. "How did you survive in there, Julian? In the dark?" Julian tapped his temple. "I wasn't in the dark, I was listening. I heard the guards talking about their wives. I heard the warden counting his bribe money. I heard the walls settling. Information is noise, brother, and I've been recording everything." Silas looked at Ilara. She was wringing out her wet hair, her face smeared with mud. but she looked beautiful. Fierce. "We need a place to go," Elara said. "Salvatore will tear the city apart tonight. Every safe house you have is compromised. Elias knows them all." Silas shook his head. "Not all of them." He looked at Julian, the foundry. Julian's eyes lit up. The old steel mill? Daddy's secret place. "Salvatore thinks it burned down in the 90s, Silas said. "He doesn't know I rebuilt the basement." "Can we get there?" Dr. Thorne asked. "We steal a car," Silas said, "and we drive fast." He looked at his hands. They were steady. The overwhelming noise was fading, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. He was beginning to understand the instrument he had been given. "Salvatore thinks I'm running," Silas whispered, the sound of his voice echoing in the pipe. "He thinks I'm a frightened animal." He looked up, his eyes hard as flint. He forgot that animals bite. The foundry was a skeletal ruin on the edge of the industrial district, a graveyard of rusted beams and collapsed brickwork. But beneath the rubble, accessible only by a hidden hydraulic lift, concealed under a pile of scrap metal, was a fortress. It was 4 a.m. The bunker was bathed in the soft blue glow of monitors. Elara was stitching a gash on Silas's arm. She worked with the precision of a surgeon, her hands warm against his cold skin. "It's deep," she murmured, but it missed the artery. Silas watched her. He wasn't looking at the wound. He was listening to her breathing. It was steady, rhythmic, a calming frequency. "Thank you," he said. His voice was getting easier to use, less like gravel, more like a low rumble of thunder. Elara looked up, her eyes meeting his. "You saved my father. You saved us." "You gave me the world," Silas replied. He reached out and touched her cheek. He had never been intimate with anyone. His world had been too small, too guarded. But now the barriers were down. She leaned into his touch. "Is it too much? The sound?" "It's chaotic," Silas admitted. "But I like the sound of your voice." She smiled, a sad, tired smile. "We're not out of this yet, Silas. Salvatore controls the police, the politicians, everyone, even if we survive tonight. How do you take back a city from a man who owns the ground you walk on?" Silas turned to the bank of monitors. Julian was already there, his fingers flying across a keyboard. He had hacked into the city's surveillance grid. "We don't fight him on the ground," Silas said. "We fight him in the air, in the signals." He walked over to Julian. "What do you have?" Julian spun around in the chair. "Oh, it's beautiful, brother." I tapped into Elias's phone, and the warden's cloud backups. "Look at this." On the screen, a web of financial transactions appeared. "Salvatore didn't just steal your inheritance," Julian explained, speaking fast, his words tumbling over each other. "He's been laundering money for the cartel through your shipping lanes. But here's the kicker. He's been skimming off the top, stealing from the Russians and the Mexicans." Silas's eyes narrowed. "He's stealing from the cartel? Greedy old spider." Julian giggled. He thought he was smart. He thought no one was listening. "If the cartel finds out," Elara started. "They kill him," Silas finished. "But that's not enough. Death is too easy for him." Silas paced the room. The sound of his boots on the concrete floor was sharp and authoritative. He was thinking in a new dimension. Before, he thought in visuals, angles, sight lines. Now he thought in echoes, consequences. "Tomorrow is the commission meeting," Silas said. "The annual sit-down. All the 5 families, the Russians, the cartel representatives, they'll all be at the Opera House. Salvatore will be there to announce your tragic death and claim the throne," Dr. Thorne said from the cot where he was resting. "Exactly," Silas said. He turned to the group. A plan was forming. A plan that required absolute precision. "Elara," Silas said, "can you adjust the magnet, the jamming device?" "Yes," she said. "Why?" "I need to be able to turn my hearing off and on at will." Silas said, "That's possible?" She nodded. "I can rig a switch." "Good." Silas turned to Julian. I need you to compile every recording, every stolen ledger, every conversation you have evidence of. Burn it onto a drive. And then, Julian asked, his head cocked. And then, Silas said, walking to the weapon rack and pulling down an assault rifle, checking the chamber with a loud clack, clack. We go to the opera. You can't just walk in there, Ilara argued. They'll shoot you on sight. No, Silas said. They won't, because they think I'm a cripple. They think I'm the deaf, dumb, broken nephew who died in the woods. He looked at his reflection in the dark monitor screen. The man staring back wasn't the Silent King anymore. He was something new. Something worse. I'm going to walk right up to Salvatore, Silas said, and I'm going to let him talk. I'm going to let him confess everything to my face, thinking I can't hear a word. And I'm going to be wearing a wire connected to the opera house sound system. Julian clapped his hands in delight. A live performance. The aria of betrayal. But first, Silas said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper, we need to send a message. Elias. He's at the penthouse, Julian said, checking a tracker, littering up the staff, celebrating your demise. Silas grabbed his coat. Ilara, stay with your father. Julian, you're with me? You're my ears until I get the hang of this. Where are we going? Julian asked, grabbing a combat knife and twirling it. To silence the rat, Silas said. The penthouse, 5:30 a.m. The sun was just beginning to bleed gray light over Lake Michigan. Inside the Vane penthouse, Elias Cross was pouring champagne. 3 of his enforcers were laughing, their feet up on Silas's mahogany desk. To the wraith, Elias toasted, mocking. May he rot in hell with his ears ringing. The men laughed. Crash! The balcony window exploded inward. Glass sprayed across the room like shrapnel. The wind roared in, carrying the sound of the storm. Silas stepped through the broken frame. He was soaked, covered in mud, his face a mask of primal rage. He held a gun in each hand. The enforcers scrambled for their weapons. Silas didn't hesitate. Bang, bang, bang. 3 shots, 3 headshots. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space, but Silas didn't flinch. He rode the sound wave. Elias froze, the champagne glass slipping from his hand and shattering on the floor. Silas hoisted his guns and walked toward Elias. Elias backed up, terrified. He raised his hands, his fingers trembling as he signed. I didn't do it. Salvatore made me. Stop, Silas said. Elias's eyes bulged. He stared at Silas's mouth. You can speak? Silas stopped in front of him. He loomed over the traitor. He could hear Elias's heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He could hear the shallow, terrified gasps of breath. I can do more than speak, Elias, Silas said, his voice deep and resonant, filling the room. I can hear you lying. Elias fell to his knees. Please, Silas, Mr. Vane, I have a family. So did I, Silas said. He grabbed Elias by the throat, lifting him off the ground. He leaned in close, whispering into Elias's ear. You spent 10 years mocking me in this room. You called me a broken toy. You thought silence was weakness. Silas tightened his grip. Now, I want you to listen very carefully. To what? Elias choked out. Silas smiled. To the sound of your empire breaking. He threw Elias across the room. Julian stepped in from the balcony, holding a tablet. Accounts drained. Julian chirped. Transfer complete. We have his leverage. Silas looked down at Elias. Get up. You're going to help us get into the opera house. And if you make a sound I don't like, I'll cut your tongue out and make you eat it. Elias nodded frantically, weeping. Silas walked to the broken window and looked out at the city. The noise of Chicago rose up to meet him. Sirens, cars, construction. It wasn't noise anymore. It was his kingdom calling him home. The Chicago Lyric Opera House was a cathedral of gold leaf and red velvet. Tonight, it was also a slaughterhouse waiting for a signal. The performance was Puccini's Tosca. On stage, the soprano's voice soared, a piercing lament of love and death. In the private box seats above, the real drama was unfolding. The heads of the 5 families, the Russian Bratva representatives, and the cartel lieutenants from Sinaloa sat in uneasy silence. They weren't watching the opera. They were watching Salvatore Vane. Salvatore stood at the front of the center box, swirling a glass of scotch. He looked like a king. "Gentlemen," Salvatore whispered, his voice carrying only to the men in the box. "Tonight, we mourn. My nephew, Silas, the poor broken boy. He has taken a turn for the worse, the mental strain of his disability." The cartel boss, a man named El Santo, narrowed his eyes. "We heard rumors of a fire at the asylum." "Tragic," Salvatore sighed. "He died in the flames. A mercy, really." Suddenly the heavy velvet curtains at the back of the box were swept aside. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Silas Vane walked in. He wore a tailored black suit that fit his broad frame like armor. His face was unbruised, his eyes clear. He didn't look broken. He looked like a famine walking into a feast. Behind him, a terrified Elias Cross was shoved into the room by an unseen force, Julian hiding in the corridor shadows. Salvatore froze. The glass in his hand trembled, the ice clinking. A sound Silas heard with perfect, crystalline clarity. "Silas," Salvatore stammered, his face draining of color. He quickly recovered, forcing a smile. "My boy, you're alive. I was just telling our friends here about your miraculous recovery." Silas didn't sign. He didn't look at Elias. He walked straight to the railing of the balcony, looking down at the stage where the execution scene of Tosca was beginning. He felt the vibration of the orchestra in his chest. It was powerful. Salvatore leaned in close to Silas's ear. "You stupid cripple," he hissed, the venom in his voice dripping. "You should have stayed dead. Now I have to kill you in front of everyone. Smile for the audience, Silas. It's your curtain call." Silas turned his head slowly. He looked Salvatore in the eye. He reached up and tapped his ear. Salvatore frowned. "What?" Silas opened his mouth. The voice that came out was low, rough, and amplified by the small lapel microphone he had pinned to his collar, a feed that Julian had just patched into the opera house's main sound system. "The curtain call isn't for me, Uncle," Silas said. His voice boomed through the entire opera house, drowning out the soprano. The music stopped. 2,000 people in the audience looked up, confused. The crime bosses in the box jumped to their feet. Salvatore stumbled back, his eyes wide with horror. You can speak." "I can hear, too," Silas said, his voice echoing from the rafters. "I heard you order the fire that killed my parents. I heard you sell out the Russians to the feds in 08. And I heard you bragging about skimming 20% off El Santo's shipments." The room went deathly still. El Santo stood up slowly, his hand moving to his jacket. "Lies," Salvatore screamed, his composure shattering. "He's insane. He's the Mad King." "Julian," Silas said calmly, "play the track." Over the massive speakers of the opera house, a recording began to play. It was crystal clear. "Stupid Mexicans won't notice the missing product. I'll blame it on the deaf kid. If they ask questions, I'll offer them Silas's head on a platter. He's just a placeholder until I can liquidate the assets." It was Salvatore's voice, undeniable. El Santo looked at Salvatore. He didn't say a word. He just nodded to his men standing by the door. Salvatore backed up, hitting the railing. No, it's a trick. It's AI. It's the truth," Silas said, stepping closer. Salvatore pulled a gun from his tuxedo. "I made you. I own you." He aimed at Silas. But before he could pull the trigger, a single shot rang out. Bang! Salvatore's gun clattered to the floor. He gripped his shoulder, screaming. Elara stood in the doorway of the box, the smoking Glock in her hand. Her hands were shaking, but her aim had been true. Silas didn't look away from his uncle. He walked forward, grabbing Salvatore by the lapels. The older man was sobbing now, a pathetic, broken figure. "You wanted silence," Silas whispered. He lifted Salvatore off his feet, then have it. Silas threw him over the railing. Salvatore Vane fell 3 stories down into the orchestra pit. He crashed through a timpani drum with a discordant final boom that reverberated through the stunned hall. Silence followed. Absolute, terrified silence. Silas stood at the railing, looking down. He straightened his jacket. He turned to the room full of the most dangerous men in the world. El Santo looked at the body below, then up at Silas. He respected strength. He respected the ruthless efficiency of the coup. "The debt is paid," El Santo said, buttoning his jacket. "Long live the king." One by one, the other dons nodded. They didn't bow. Men like that never bowed. But they acknowledged the shift in power. The Vane territory was no longer weak. It was under new management. Silas walked over to Ilara. He took the gun from her hand and gently lowered it. He looked at her, really looked at her, hearing the rapid beat of her heart slowing down, syncing with his own. "It's over," he said. Julian popped his head out from behind the curtain, grinning maniacally. "Did you hear that acoustic drop? Perfect pitch." Silas smiled, a real smile, rare and dangerous. He offered his arm to Ilara. "Let's go home," Silas said. "It's too loud in here." And that is how the Silent King reclaimed his voice. Silas Vane didn't just break the silence. He weaponized it, turning the very thing meant to destroy him into his greatest strength. In the end, he learned that family isn't just blood. It's the people who help you hear the truth when the world is full of noise. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. What would you do if you found out your entire life was a lie, orchestrated by the person you trusted most? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss a story. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next video.